There's a certain kind of desperation that only a drought can bring. When the river turns to a skeleton of bleached stone and the only thing left to harvest is dust. In the year of the great dry spell, Billy Jack traded his last milk cow for a handful of glowing seeds. In place of a golden harp, he finds a mountain dulcimer and a massive bean tree climbing right out of the red clay to bring the water back to a river that had run bone dry.
Most folks know the story of a boy, some magic beans, and a castle in the sky. But what would this fairy tale look like if it happened in the world I know, the foothills of the Appalachians? In place of the English countryside and a golden harp, let's use a mountain dulcimer and a massive bean tree that climbs right out of the red clay. To capture the scale of this story, we'll hike through Hocking Hills to Cedar Falls. Between the towering sandstone cliffs, a giant waterfall, and an old 80-foot fire tower, it feels like a magical place where a giant just might peek over the mountain. If the world feels a little too loud today, I'm glad you found your way to the ridge top. There's no rush here. Just settle in. Let's begin.
Billy Jack and the Bean Tree, or Jack and the Beanstalk, Appalachian Edition. In those days, the Doolish River had run dry. It lay like the skeleton of a great beast, nothing but sun-bleached stones and cracked pools of silt where catfish used to swim. Folks had almost forgotten the sound of water. Instead, the air carried the dry rattle of corn husks and the mournful lowing of cattle with little to chew on but dust. Billy Jack sat on the porch edge, lacing his work boots. He was a young man of lean muscle and quiet habits, handy as a pocket on a shirt when it came to mending a fence or fixing a roof. But you can't fix a drought with a hammer and nails. He'd spent the morning trying to douse for a new well, but the branch had stayed stubborn and still. He looked toward the barnyard where their milk cow, Honey Gal, stood in the shade of a dying oak. She wasn't just livestock. She was a gentle fixture of their lives. Her dull coat was once the color of clover honey. Now her ribs showed like the rafters of an old barn. His mother stepped onto the porch and leaned against the railing, her gaze following his to the cow. "We've held on to her longer than we should, Billy Jack," she said, her voice tired and thin. "Honey Gal's gone dry as the river itself, and there's not even a bucket of water left in the well." Billy Jack stood up. "I'll take her into town. Maybe someone from outside can take her on, and she'll bring enough money to see us through." His mother sighed. "I hate it more than I can say, but it's cruel to keep her in the state we're in." Billy Jack nodded. He walked to the barn, looped a frayed rope around Honey Gal's neck, and whispered a quiet promise into her ear. Together they started down the baked earth path, the only sound the rhythmic thud of his boots and the slow, tired shuffle of the cow behind him. The walk to town was a long trek through the ghost of once rich farmlands. Honeysuckle used to perfume that walk, but now the vines were curled tight and brittle against the heat. The red clay of the wagon track was cracked into 1,000 tiny canyons. When he reached the crossroads where the wagon track split toward the county seat, there sat a strange little creature on a chestnut stump. The man was unnaturally small, no bigger than a butter churn, wearing a coat of velvet green lichen and a hat made from a cured mushroom cap. His eyes had the sparkle of sunlight on a mica bed. "Heading somewhere with that cow, son?" the little man spoke, his voice creaky as an old floorboard. Billy Jack stopped, wiping the dust from his forehead. "Taking her to the market for sale," he said. "There's nothing left for her back home but thirst and starvation." The little man hopped down from his stump and walked a slow circle around Honey Gal. looking at her with a keen, professional eye. "She's got the frame of a good milker," he said, nodding to himself. "A faithful producer, I'd wager." "She is that," Billy Jack agreed, his hand resting on Honeygal's neck. "And a better companion you couldn't ask for. I don't really want to sell her. We've held out until the well ran dry. But a man can't watch a creature like this wither away." The little man nodded slowly. "It's a shame to trade a family friend for a handful of paper money. That cash will be gone before you know it, and you'll be right back where you started." The stranger reached into a deep pocket, and rather than a wad of cash, he pulled out 5 beans. They didn't look like any seeds Billy Jack had ever seen. They possessed a faint, warm glow, like embers pulled from a winter hearth. "These here seeds don't care a lick about the dry spells or the cracked earth," the stranger said, leaning in close. "They'll find the water hidden deep in the earth and grow even while the corn turns to tinder. I'll trade you these beans for your cow, Billy Jack, and you'll be planting a sure crop." Billy Jack looked at the glowing beans, then back at the dusty path he'd just walked. He thought of the empty pantry covered in red dust. A few dollar bills would buy flour for a month, maybe 2, but a crop that could drink from the deep dark of the earth? That was a future. It was a gamble, but his heart told him that a sure crop was worth more than money that would just slip through their fingers like sand. "I'll take the trade." He handed over the rope, took the glowing seeds, and headed home. The walk back felt twice as long as the walk out. Without Honeygal's steady steps behind him, the journey was too quiet. A deep, dusty silence that rang in Billy Jack's ears. He kept his hand in his pocket. His fingers curled around the 5 beans. They felt warm, almost pulsing with a slow, deep heat that made the hair on his arms prickle. As he rounded the bend to the farm, he saw his mother sitting on the top step of the porch. She wasn't working. Her hands, usually busy with a rolling pin or a broom, were folded in her lap, idle and heavy. Her face fell when she saw his empty hands. Billy Jack didn't have the wad of crumpled bills she was counting on. "Did you get her sold?" she asked, her voice sharpened by anxiety. "What'd they give you for her?" "I didn't take money, Ma," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I took a trade. I met a little man at the crossroad. More mountain spirit than man, I'd wager. He said these seeds were special. Said they grow a crop even in a dry spell like this." He opened his palm. In the fading light, the 5 seeds gave off a faint, strange shimmer. To Billy Jack, they looked like a promise. To his mother, they looked like a ruinous mistake. She stood up, her shadow long and stark against the porch boards. The exhaustion in her face shifted into a sharp, desperate frustration. "Seeds!" she cried, her voice thin and brittle. "You traded our prize cow, our last bit of worth in this world, for a handful of garden beans?" "Ma, listen," he said. "I don't care what some drifters said." She stepped down the steps, her eyes bright with anger. "We need a way to survive, and you bring back a handful of seeds that'll just sit in the dust and die like everything else on this farm." In a sudden burst of energy, Billy Jack's mother snatched the seeds from his hand and flung them against the side of the house. "You've got more sense than that, Billy Jack," she snapped. "I never thought you could be such a fool." The seeds hit the earth and didn't even bounce. Those beans sunk into the parched earth as if they'd been waiting for the invitation. Neither Billy Jack or his mother noticed. They were both too heavy-hearted by their argument. "Go to bed," she said, her back already turned as she headed for the door. "Maybe you can find some dinner in your dreams, because there's nothing in the kitchen." Billy Jack didn't argue. He went to his room and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep, exhausted by the day and the weight of his mother's words. The house sat in an unnatural stillness that night, as if the farm itself was waiting. But beneath the floorboards, the seeds weren't still. They sprouted and pushed through the hard-packed clay, seeking. Once the roots touched water, the magic surged, sending shoots upward through the dark. A silent, silver-gray power braided itself against the cabin walls and climbed into the dark. When Billy Jack woke the next morning, a strange, green-tinted light filtered through his window. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, confused. Pulling on his boots, he stepped out into a world transformed. Where the seeds fell, a massive, weathered bean tree had twisted its way out of the ground. Its trunk was gnarled and sturdy as oak. Its leaves were wide as porch swings, shimmering with a heavy dew that hadn't been seen in the valley for years. It claimed the sky, its crown disappearing into the thick morning mist that clung to the mountaintop. Billy Jack stood for a long moment, his neck craned back, trying to take it all in. It was a beautiful, impossible thing. The tree climbed past the eaves of the house and into the clouds. Jack looked round the empty yard. Without waking his mother, he caught hold of the first great branch, tested its weight, and began to climb. As Billy Jack crested the clouds, the brassy, choking heat of the valley fell away, replaced by a mist that was cool and damp. His lungs, so used to breathing red dust, filled with a sweetness that made his head spin. When he hauled himself over the last branch, the view stopped him dead in his tracks. Before him lay a mountain plateau graced with a massive mountain lake, its surface shimmering like a sapphire. As his eyes followed the shoreline, he saw a great dam built of high country boulders. It sat at the mountain's throat, holding back every drop of water that should have been feeding the Doolish River. "Right purty, ain't it?" There sat the little man from the crossroads, perched on a rock and swinging his feet. He pointed past the lake toward a farmhouse so large it looked like a mountain peak itself. "The giant that lives there is the one that built that dam. He took the water from your valley and the life with it." Billy Jack's fist tightened. Here was the reason for the Doolish River being dry. He didn't consider himself a hero, but he was a fixer. Was there a way he could fix the Doolish? The giant's house cast a shadow long enough to cover the whole valley. He'd never seen anything built on such a scale. Measuring the distance and the risk, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He needed to see what they all were up against. As Billy Jack neared, the scent of wood smoke and roasted ham filled the damp air. He and his empty belly slipped through a gap beneath the door and into a kitchen that smelled so delicious it made his head swim. The cast-iron stove was a blackened monument of metal with a firebox that roared like a furnace. Beside it sat a woodpile where the logs were the size of whole oak trunks, and the floorboards beneath his boots were as wide as a paved road. To his left, a copper wash boiler stood like a water tower, and the air was thick with a savory steam of a meal that could feed 100 men. The giant's wife stood at a table. She was a woman of uncommon scale, her apron a vast field of bleached muslin. Her arms moved like slow tides as she kneaded dough the size of a mattress. When she spied Billy Jack, her eyes widened. "Law, child," she rumbled in a voice like a distant rock slide. "You're nothing but skin and bone. How long has it been since you've had a proper meal?" She reached down with a hand as broad as a grain shovel and gently scooped him up. Billy Jack felt his stomach lurch as she set him down on the edge of the scrubbed oak table. Then she proceeded to dish up a portion of ham and potatoes into a bowl that could have served as a wash basin. Billy Jack didn't need further invitation. He fell on the food, the meal finally quieting the ache in his middle. Then Billy Jack's eyes wandered across the vast landscape of the tabletop. Right beside his bowl sat a flour bin the size of a smokehouse. He noticed its heavy iron hinge. A piece of metal as thick as a porch railing was rusted nearly solid, weeping orange streaks against the wood and groaning like a dying tree every time the wife reached for a scoop. Billy Jack asked for a small bit of lard from the woman's tin and set to work mending the hinge, figuring that a little grease might go a long way in fixing the hinge and buying the woman's favor. "You're a handy one," she whispered, a look of quiet wonder filling her face. "Nobody's fixed a thing in this house for a dog's age." Then her expression sharpened with fear. A heavy rhythmic thudding started in the distance, growing louder until the copper pots on the walls began to clang like bells. "If my mister catches a whiff of you," the wife hissed, her face pale, "he'll have you for a snack before I can even butter the biscuits. Let's get you into the wash boiler, quick now." Billy Jack fell into the copper boiler just in time. The giant's boots sounded like the falling of heavy timber as he marched across the floor. Then he stopped, right in front of the great copper wash boiler, his great nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. "Fee, fa, foy," the giant bellowed, a sound that rattled the teeth in Billy Jack's head. "I smell the sweat of a holler boy." "Hush now, mister," the wife said calmly, her voice steady and sure as she slid a platter of fried meat toward him. "It's just this scent of the ham and baking biscuits. Sit and eat your fill." The giant grumbled, pacing the floorboards near the copper tank as he took one last long sniff. Finally, he sat. The massive chair groaned under his weight. "Biscuits don't smell like holler boys," he muttered. But the clatter of his fork against the plate soon drowned out his suspicions. From under the heavy copper lid, Billy Jack watched. When the last of the gravy was mopped up, the giant called for his purdy bird. His wife brought out a small, russet-colored hen and settled the bird onto a velvet pillow in the center of the table. "Lay," the giant commanded. The hen gave a soft, musical cluck, and there, nestled against the velvet, was an egg of solid, glittering gold. The giant watched it with a greedy light in his eyes until his head began to nod. Across the table, the wife's head began to dip. Soon, a double snore filled the kitchen, one like a rumbling thunderstorm, and the other like wind whipping through the chimney. Billy Jack carefully heaved the lid and scrambled out. He climbed the table leg with the practiced grip of a boy who'd spent his life in the rafters of a barn. Once on the tabletop, he studied the magical creature and its glittering egg. The hen didn't squawk. She looked at him with recognition and stepped into his waiting arms. A deep knowing came over him. This hen was a captive from the valley, just like all that water in the lake. Billy Jack didn't waste a second. He carried the hen across the vast oak planks of the table, down to the floor, and out through the gap in the door. As he began his descent down the bean tree, he tucked the bird against his chest, her warmth welcome against the cool mist. Billy Jack's mother had spent the day watching the bean tree with a heavy heart. She feared the high country had swallowed him whole, and she cried tears of joy upon his return. Billy Jack placed the russet hen on the kitchen table, where it clucked out a glittering golden egg, and her tears turned to wonder. Each day after Billy Jack's return, he watched the dry dust blow past and pondered. He knew the gold was only a bandage. The Doolish River was still dry, its lifeblood choked by that dam of boulders above the clouds. The Doolish was broken, and Billy Jack couldn't leave a broken thing be. Early one morning, he quietly packed up his kit and climbed back up into the mist. When he slipped under the giant's door again, the kitchen felt different, the air heavier. The giant's wife worked by the hearth with an air of deep melancholy. When she spotted Billy Jack, she didn't look so kindly this time. "You took his hen," she said. "My mister has been in a black rage ever since. He's nearly shaken the house down looking for that bird. You're a thief, plain and simple." "That hen belonged to the valley," Billy Jack said, stepping fully into the light. "But I've come back to make a square deal. The latch on your great larder door is failing. Let me set it right as payment for the bird, and then I'll be gone." The wife looked at the massive larder door, then back at the small boy. Her anger faltered. "The latch is a trial," she admitted, her voice softening. "He nearly ripped the door off its hinges this morning." So, while she prepared the giant's meal, Billy Jack worked with a silent, steady focus, resetting the massive iron latch. He made the huge mechanism move as smooth as silk. Just as he was tightening the final screw, the giant's wife jumped. The floor began to buck. A roar echoed from the hallway, more violent than before. "He's here," the wife hissed, her face turning ashen. "Hide! Quick!" She shoved him into the larder just as the door burst open. The giant's eyes were red-rimmed and restless. He didn't head for his chair. He stopped in the center of the room and threw his head back. "Fee, faw, foy," he bellowed, the sound vibrating the very foundations. "I smell the breath of a holler boy." "Nonsense, mister," the wife said, her voice strained as she hoisted a platter holding a whole roasted hog. Its skin crackled and glistened with fat. "It's only the scorched pork and the steam of the mustard greens. Let your rage go and sit and eat your fill." The giant grumbled. "Smells like the dry rot of the valley." But the sight of the hog drew him to the table. Billy Jack watched through the slits, terrified as the giant began to tear into the meat, snapping the heavy bones as if they were matchsticks. As soon as the last bone of the hog was picked clean, the wife wiped her hands on her apron and stood. "Now, mister," she said, her voice thin and tired, "I'm going up to the loft to work on my quilt." "First, fetch me my money bags," the giant rumbled, leaning back until the chair frame screamed. "I want to count my gold before I sleep." The wife disappeared into the back of the house and returned lugging 2 canvas sacks, each the size of a prize-winning hog. The giant poured the coins out and stacked them into towers as tall as Billy Jack's head, muttering to himself until the rhythm of the gold and the weight of his supper began to pull at his eyelids. Slowly, his head dipped. The counting slowed, then stopped. A snore, like a rock slide, began to roll through the kitchen. Billy Jack didn't hesitate. He eased the larder door open, the repaired latch moving in a blessed, silent glide. He knew those bags were his people's sweat and blood, and he wasn't leaving without them. Billy Jack filled first one bag, then the other, hoisting them over his shoulders. They were heavy, but he was used to carrying hay bales. He slowly made his way back to the clouds, the clink of the gold muffled by his woolen shirt. When he finally hauled the canvas bags onto his own kitchen table, his mother didn't reach for the coins. She pulled him into a hug of pure relief. "Billy Jack," she cried, her voice trembling, "we have the hen and now we have the gold. We can buy food and we can wait out this dry spell. Promise me you'll not set foot on that bean tree again." Billy Jack looked into her tired eyes and then out at the porch where the dust coated the railing. He gave her his word, and for 2 days he kept it. The golden eggs and the heavy sacks brought a feast to every table in the valley, but Billy Jack couldn't rest in the success. Every morning he walked down to the banks of the Doolish and stared at the parched, cracked bed. To Billy Jack, the giant had done more than steal wealth. He'd broken the life connection between the mountain and the valley. "I haven't finished the job, Mother," he said quietly on the 3rd morning. He checked his toolkit, ensuring his oil and driver were in place, and gathered a fresh coil of twine. He didn't look back as he stepped off the porch and headed for the base of the bean tree. The weight of his broken promise was heavy, but the need to return the river to its banks was heavier still. Billy Jack slipped inside the giant's house for the 3rd time. The place was laying in shambles, as if a tornado had come through. Keeping to the shadows, he moved undetected to the massive wood box. There he hid and positioned himself with a clear view of the kitchen. The giant's wife moved slowly, her shoulders hunched. Every time she turned to stir the pot of beans, a tear would catch the light and fall into the steam. She looked like a woman broken-hearted. Then the floor began to buck, and the back door slammed open like a rifle shot. The giant stormed in, his boots caked in red mountain clay, his nostrils flaring. "Fee, faw, foy," he bellowed, the sound vibrating the very doorboards Billy Jack pressed his face against. "I smell the blood of a holler boy." In a fit of fury, the giant swung his fist the size of a cider barrel, smashing a section of the fieldstone wall. Boulders went flying and dust filled the air. "He's here! He's under the boards or behind the stones. I'll tear this house to the ground to find him." His wife stood her ground. "There is no boy, mister," she said, her voice filled with anger and exhaustion. "You've torn up every cupboard and pulled up every bed for 3 days. Your mind is playing tricks. Now sit and eat. I've brought out your singing dulcimer. The music always settles you. Now be grateful no one has laid a finger on it." The giant paused, his chest heaving. He looked at the long cherrywood case on the table, then back at his wife. Her honest exhaustion seemed to finally sap the rage out of him. He grumbled a low sound like distant thunder and slumped into his massive chair. "Sing," he commanded, his voice thick with weariness. The case swung open, and the singing dulcimer began to hum a silver melody that pulled the tension right out of the room. A sharp, sweet tune that echoed off the farmhouse rafters. As the giant began to eat, his head already nodding to the rhythm, his wife slipped toward the stairs to the loft, leaving him alone with his meal and his music. Billy Jack kept watch and pondered his next steps. He realized that he was looking at the only thing strong enough to free the valley's water, the giant himself. If Billy Jack stole the dulcimer, he could bait that blind rage down to the dam. Somehow he would find a way to direct that fury onto the dam and set the valley free. When the last silver note faded, the giant's snoring turned into a deep, rhythmic rumble. Billy Jack slipped from the wood box, quietly snatched the singing dulcimer from the table. He was through the door before the giant stirred a muscle. He was halfway to the dam when the instrument finally realized it was in a stranger's arms. "Holler boy! Holler boy!" the dulcimer shrieked, its voice a sharp, brassy alarm that shattered the mountain silence. The farmhouse behind him didn't just wake, it seemed to explode. A roar of pure, unleashed fury tore through the mist, followed by the thunder of boots that made Billy Jack's teeth rattle. He didn't look back. He sprinted for the headwaters, the screaming Dulcimer tucked under his arm like a stolen ham, leading the giant straight toward the edge of the world. Billy Jack reached the dam, but a cold jolt of terror told him there was no directing this kind of fury. The giant wasn't just angry, he was a wall of raging power that swallowed the sky. Billy Jack had brought a hurricane to the cliffside, and it was about to consume him. He threw himself down the bean tree, scrambling through the vines in a blind rush for his life. Above him, the giant didn't stop at the edge. Enraged by the shrieking Dulcimer, the man leaped. Billy Jack hit the dirt and lunged for the woodshed, trading the singing instrument for the cold steel of his double-bit axe. He swung against the base of the bean tree with everything he had, his rhythm steady, even as the ground trembled with the giant's descent. Above, the bean tree groaned and tilted. The giant let out a strangled roar, flailing wildly until his log-like fingers found purchase on the rim of the great dam. Under that immense weight, the stone structure shuddered and failed. With a crack that thundered through the valley, the boulders gave way. Then the giant fell, a massive shadow tumbling through the mist. And right behind him came the water, rushing over the broken ledge and chasing the giant all the way to the valley floor. It wasn't a flood of destruction, it was a homecoming, a roaring mass of foam crashing back into its original bed. Billy Jack stood on the bank, his chest heaving, his hands cramped around the hickory handle of his axe. He watched the water surge past the farmyard, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and life. The job was finished. The connection was restored, and the giant lay shattered at the foot of the mountain. By the time the sun set, the Doolish was flowing through the valley and singing again. It chuckled over the stones and swirled into deep pools under the sycamores. Billy Jack stood on his porch, his mother beside him. There was gold on their table, a singing Dulcimer on the wall, a magical hen pecking in their yard. But it was the sound of the Doolish that was the greatest treasure. The strange little man from the crossroads was there too, perched on his porch railing. He nodded toward the river. "The Doolish has its voice back, Billy Jack," he said softly. Billy Jack, handy as a pocket on a shirt, sat down to listen. In the quiet, he could hear the gentle rhythm of a river that would never go dry again.